So today we're going to be talking about following, and to me, the thing that I really felt when I was prepping for this message was, what did it look like to follow, and more importantly, like, why should we follow? I feel like if you really were to look at things that are very divisive today, when I talk to my friends, when I talk to my students, when I talk to other people, one of the things that are most divisive is this idea of being a Christian or not being a Christian, because especially when you look on the political spectrum, those two things are really tied together, and it kind of causes a lot of rifts. So the question is, do we follow what Jesus says in the Bible, or do we follow what the world is saying, and maybe are we in a post-Christian society? There's all these different things that kind of pop up. And so when I was looking at this message and this idea of go get the boat, I kind of really just looked into that chapter and that story. And for me, I was reading it, I was like, wow, this really does kind of mimic what I've found in my personal walk with Christ. So as always, if you've ever listened to any of my messages, it's very much like, hey, we're going to read the Bible, we're going to jam through. So if you want, I'm going to be reading through the message. I'm going to basically just cover Matthew 14, verses 13 all the way to 69, and we're going to break it down. Then we're going to go to John. So if you want, you can pull up Matthew chapter 13 and John 6, because I'm going to kind of blaze through some of it. But I encourage you guys to read these stories after and just see what is God speaking to you through them. Okay? All right, so let's get started. So first off, let's start off with Matthew 14, verses 13 through 21. It says this: When Jesus heard what had happened, he withdrew by boat privately to a solitary place. Hearing of this, the crowds followed him on foot from the towns. When Jesus landed, he saw a large crowd. He had compassion on them and healed their sick. As evening approached, the disciples came to him and said, "This is a remote place. It's already getting late. Send the crowds away so they can go to the villages and buy themselves food." Jesus replied, "They do not need to go away. You give them something to eat." "We only have 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish," they answered. "Bring them here," he said. And he directed the people to sit down on the grass. Taking the 5 loaves and 2 fish, looking up to heaven, he gave thanks, broke the loaves, and gave them to the disciples. And the disciples gave them to the people. They all ate and were satisfied. The disciples picked up 12 basketfuls of broken pieces that were left over. The number of those who ate was about 5,000 besides men and women. See, what happened was Jesus found himself in a situation where he had a ton of people following him. They were away from a bunch of the major villages, so much so there were 5,000. So the disciples logically were thinking, okay, we have a bunch of people. We don't have a lot of food. They're going to get hungry soon. What do we need to do? Send them back to their villages to eat. And then Jesus kind of saw this as a learning opportunity. He said, hey, instead of sending them away, why don't you give them what they need? You know, and then from there, they were like, hey, all we got is 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. And then they had to do a very, very small thing. They just had to hand it out. Jesus was the one who multiplied. They were the ones who handed it out. And then it says he picked up 12 basketfuls of broken pieces that were left over. The number of those who ate was about 5,000 men besides women and children. There are some people who say, oh yeah, the 12 basketfuls was like a sign for each of the disciples. Look how much I can provide. I can provide for all of you guys. But to me, I think the most important thing from this is learning to follow what is Jesus's leads? What are God's leads? What are those things where he's saying, hey, you feed them? What are those times in our lives where God says, hey, you're enough, you go do it? Because I feel like for me, it's hard when I talk to people who are growing in their relationship with Christ, whether they're people who are a bit older than me, people my age, people who are in high school, early college. I get the chance to talk with a lot of people, and when I talk with them, almost across the board, the hardest thing is, how do I hear God? Like if God came down in front of me and said, hey, I want you to do this, I'll do it. But God hasn't showed up in front of me yet. So what do I do? How do I know whether it's me or God? How do I hear God? And I think that that's really difficult. For me, I was looking back at it and I was like, honestly, I don't think I've ever seen God like show up in front of me and just start speaking to me. Dave spoke before about his backpack moment where he met this guy who was like, yeah, I'm pretty sure that guy was an angel. I don't think I've ever had that experience. But one of the things that I noticed was there were a lot of times where God didn't come down and just say, John, I want you to do A, B, C, X, Y, Z. But instead he was just like, oh, that guy looks hungry. You go feed him. And it was just more like this nudge. So I think the first thing when it comes to following is it's just really important to think, are we hearing God? Are we listening for God? Are we having our eyes and ears open to what God is saying? I wanted to share 4 stories about really random times that made huge impacts in my life. The first was, as you guys know, as I mentioned all the time, I'm a teacher. I teach at Roosevelt High School. It's my alma mater. I love my school. I love that community, and I am so blessed that I get to be able to teach there. And a lot of people, when I talk to them about teaching, they're like, oh yeah, no, it must be easy being a math teacher. There are a ton of jobs. There aren't actually a ton of jobs. Every year we post maybe one math job. I look around just to see how many they're needed. A lot of math teachers, especially in town, are kind of sticking. It's not too bad to find a job, but it's not like there are just tons of jobs open all the time. And so for me, on that journey to becoming a math teacher, I wasn't really sure 100% what I wanted to do in college, but I was like, okay, maybe education. And then instead of going and becoming an education major, became a math major. And the reason why, and I don't think she knows this necessarily, but was because I had a conversation with Auntie Tammy. We were at one of the church picnics one day, and I just had a conversation with her, and she's like, hey, John, so what are you gonna do after high school? And I'm just like, oh, I'm thinking of going to teaching. She's like, you should be a math major. I was like, okay, we're being a math major. That was the only thing that I needed. And the thing, though, if you've ever been in education, you know that in order to teach, you need to not just be good at math, but you need to take a teaching degree. I didn't have a teaching degree when I graduated. And so because of that, I was like, okay, I'm not sure what I'm going to do. Let's go get a major in math. And I was praying about it. I was like, okay, God, we're going to get our master's in mathematics education. And I felt God say, no. And I was like, well, okay, then what do I do with this then? What do I do with my math major? And then I was like, maybe I'll become a sub. So I became a sub, and a bunch of stuff kind of worked out. And because I wasn't in the teaching pool, and because I was an emergency hire, I was able to get a job about 1 week before school started at Kalani. A guy said he was going to have open heart surgery and was going to be out for about maybe a week or two. Yeah, no. So I did something for him for the entire quarter. And on the last day of the quarter, I was like, okay, I don't know what I'm going to do next. I was trying to find another long-term sub job. Didn't work out. So then I was like, okay, you know what we're going to do? We're going to do whatever God tells me to do. We're just going to go sub wherever. He told me to sub, so we're going to do that. We'll figure out what we're doing. And then I worked in in college with Kristen at the UH Oceanography office. I went to go visit her and a bunch of my old coworkers just for a random lunch one day. And I was like, oh, I kind of need to use the bathroom, so I'm going to go to Paradise Palms. I went there, and I ran into my old math teacher from Roosevelt. And he's like, hey, you're a sub, right? I'm like, yeah. He's like, someone just left. Do you want a job? And so I've been there ever since. All of this happened because I had a random conversation with Auntie Tammy, and it was just kind of like, oh yeah, I guess that's what we're doing. You know, it wasn't like God came down and was like, John, you're going to be a math teacher at Roosevelt. You're going to this. But no, it was just something really passing. That for some reason, that I can't, without describing, I was just like, it just feels like Uncle Neil used to always tell me, you just know it in your knower, where it's just like something was like, I feel like that's good advice. That's just something we do. So then I did that. A second time is I fell in love with reading the Bible. As you guys notice, almost all of my messages come from me reading the Bible 80% and me speaking maybe 20%. This is probably the most I've spoken outside of the Bible in a while. And the reason why I fell in love, I hated reading the Bible growing up. It was literally a punishment for me at homeschooling. If I wasn't writing neatly, I had to transcribe the Bible. And I remember one time, it wasn't nice. So my dad ripped the page up and said, do it again. And I had to cry again. I'm like, rewrite again. but so it was... But so, did you know that? Okay, that happened at the office, yeah. I was there, there was hot butter all over my shirt, and then I had to redo it. So there were a lot of people who were just like, don't force your kids to read the Bible because they're gonna dislike blah, 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 blah. That wasn't the case because for me, I just couldn't get into reading the Bible. But then my dad, again, he was leading his small groups through this book called Soul Revolution, and there was this app that every hour on the hour, it would pop up a verse. And I saw those verses, and I was just like, there were these 3 verses that popped up, and I was like, wow. Something about that is just speaking to me. And then I just started reading that book. That book was 1 John, and if you've ever spent any time doing any sort of discipleship with me, that's probably the core that I'm like, if someone wants to know what it means to really be a follower of God, and you're willing to read through John's meandering thoughts, then 1 John is the book for you. It changed the way that I see being a Christian. And it just came because I was just like, I have to download this app that's going to use up some of my precious data and my tiny storage space. But we chose to do it because for some reason Dad asked me to. And I was like, okay, we're going to do it. Next was I was driving a non-Christian friend home one day. We were at Karaoke and we're driving him home, and he was just like, oh, how come you don't listen to like Christian music? Like, like 50 Cent, not really Christian. So then for me, it was just like, I was like, oh, maybe I should. And then so I started listening to worship music every morning on my drive into work. It was about 1 hour, and I would get stuck in traffic going from Hawaii Kai to Roosevelt, and I would just play worship music, and I started worshiping. And for those of you who know me, I love to worship, and I've even had the pleasure of being able to lead worship here. And a big part of it I attribute to that one comment from my friend, because that forced me to start singing worship more and more and more. For those of you who are just like, okay, John sounds not bad when he sings, Michelle, my older sister, literally asked me multiple times to only sing when she was unconscious because it was so bad. She has near perfect pitch. She says, it hurts my ears. But I kind of kept through it. I talked with my mom about it. She was just like, how did you keep through it? And a big part was because I was like, dude, I just want to worship. I want to be able to sing praises to God. And I would do that every hour for a day because of this one passing comment that my friend, who was maybe slightly less than sober, said to me on a night home from Kakaako. It's when we hear God, apparently. The last one, and it's hilarious because today we're talking about learn to follow. The very first message I gave was at a youth camp, and it was called Follow Me. The entire thing from, do you remember that, Ty? Wait, no, that was before you. That was Kimmy and Rena. That was the year before you guys. But it was a message that I built off of a book that we ended up when I was talking about it, the entire camp was like, hey, that's a good thing. So we named the entire camp Follow Me, and it was based off this book by David Platt. The reason why I found the book was I was walking through Barnes & Noble, and this orange book caught my eye. I never walked through the Christian section, but I just felt like, buy it. And I was like, okay, we'll buy it. All of these different things were little nudges that God used to make huge changes in my life. And I feel like when we're looking at what's happening here with the disciples, when he's talking about, hey, bring me what you got, bring me those loaves and fish. That's these stories in my life. Those times where it's not like I felt like, God, I had a decision. God, what do I do? Do I do this? Do I do that? What do I do? But it was just all these random little things that God used to help me make those decisions. I did pray. I did ask God, hey, where should I work? I did have an opportunity to work at Castle High School. I just felt like God was saying, no, that's not it. And then I said, okay. And then after that, God used those little nudges to help me kind of, run into the guy who was going to need open heart surgery and be gone for 2 weeks. And then my math teacher eventually. When we're following God, it's all about our willingness to do what he says. And a big part of it for us is being open to hearing what he says. Sometimes we wait for those giant writing in the sky, writing on the walls. But sometimes it's not just that. It's just being open to saying, what are the little things God's using throughout the day in order to kind of just nudge my life? Are we being open to that? Am I leaving room for God? Or is everything in my schedule so packed that I have everything planned? God promises to take care of us. In Matthew 6, it says this, seek first his kingdom and his righteousness, and everything else will be added to you. In Proverbs 3, it says, trust in the Lord with all your heart. Lean not on your own understandings. In all your ways acknowledge him, and he will make your path straight. Don't be wise in your own eyes. Fear the Lord and turn from evil. The first thing when we're looking through this is Jesus will give us what we need. We just need to be willing to listen. When we're following, it's hard to follow without direction. So are we being open in our day-to-day lives to saying, what are the adjustments that God has? What are the things that maybe don't make sense? Like, I don't like reading books. When I was in elementary school, the only books I read were like Berenstain Bears and like history textbooks. And there was nothing in between. But for some reason, that orange book just stood out to me. And I even reread it to this day. And there's just some principles in there that for some reason it speaks to me. That God used that to transform the way I am. Are we listening to when people make comments and I'm just like, oh yeah, maybe I should listen to more worship music? What are those things that are in our lives that God is just placing there to get our attention? The second thing is, the first is following Jesus. Jesus gives us what he needs. We just need to listen. The second is following Jesus really requires our trust in him. Following Jesus requires our trust in him. And when we trust in Jesus, we have to say, regardless of what's going on in the world, regardless of what any forecasts look like, are we going to choose to do what Jesus says to do, what God says to do? Follow the example that Jesus has laid out for us. In Matthew chapter 14, verses 22 to 32, it talks about this. And this here is another story that a lot of people know, but not a lot of people necessarily that I talk to know that this happens directly after feeding 5,000. So immediately after this, Jesus made the disciples get into the boat, go on ahead of him to the other side where he dismissed the crowd. He had dismissed them. After he had dismissed them, he went up to the mountainside by himself to pray. Later that night, he was alone, and the boat was already a considerable distance from land, buffeted by the waves and the wind that was against it. Shortly before dawn, Jesus went out walking on the lake. When the disciples saw him walking on the lake, they were terrified. "It's a ghost," they said. They cried out in fear. But Jesus immediately said to them, "Take courage, it is I, don't be afraid." "Lord, if it's you," Peter replied, "tell me to come to you on the water." "Come," he said. Peter got out of the boat, walked out on the water, came towards Jesus. But when he saw the winds, he was afraid, began to sink, cried out, "Lord, save me." Immediately after, Jesus reached out his hand and caught him. "You of little faith, why did you doubt?" Then they climbed into the boat, the wind died down, and those who were in the boat worshipped him, saying, "Truly, you are the Son of God." There are two major choices here. Now, a lot of people really focus on Jesus walking on water, and because that's kind of a big deal. But for me, something that stuck out to me as I read this was this first verse here. It says this: immediately Jesus made the disciples get into the boat and go ahead of him. And for me, this here required a certain amount of obedience from the disciples, because in this time, the disciples are just kind of starting to follow Jesus. They're following this guy who's a teacher. They're like, okay, this is going to be our next religious leader. John the Baptist recently had just died, so this guy's kind of our guy. And they truly believed that he was going to set up a physical earthly kingdom. And so he takes a few loaves of bread and fish and feeds an entire multitude of people. And this is a society where the majority of their day is spent making sure they can provide for themselves and their family. And this guy, who is your religious leader, comes and does it. They're like, this guy is the Messiah, the person who God has promised to deliver us, to save us, to rescue us. And the disciples, especially if you read through all of the Gospels, there's so many instances where the disciples knew that there was something special about Jesus, but they kind of had it a little off. At one point, James and John ask, "Hey, can I be at your left and right side when you set up your kingdom?" Because they were like, we want positions of power. We are going to help you. We want something in return from this earthly kingdom. And so when Jesus is feeding these people, it says in John 6 that the crowds, they were starting to say, "Dude, we got to make this guy king. This guy, look what he can do for us." And then so the disciples hearing this probably were getting a little like, "Yeah, that's right. Look what we can do for you guys." And then Jesus says, no, get out of here and get in the boat. There are some scholars who believe that Jesus did that in order to refocus them. But the words that were used here, Jesus made them, is kind of a forceful verb. It's not like, if you look at the original language, it's not like, "Oh, hey, can you please?" It's just like, no, go. When we follow Jesus, sometimes it requires us to have obedience. Sometimes it requires us to say, "Hey, something good is going on here from what we see, but go get the boat." After that, there was the storm. And they're kind of getting bashed around. And again, there's nothing that says here, but in the back of my mind, I'm just like, there's probably something in those disciples that were like, "Man, if we stayed on land." We had a bunch of guys there praising our leader. We had a bunch of guys that were just getting hyped up, talking about king. And now we're in the middle of this storm, in the middle of nowhere. I believe in either John or Mark's telling, it says that it was about 3, 4 a.m. in the morning at this point. So they're out all night. How much safer would it have been if we were on land? But Jesus tells us, get the boat. What are the times in our lives where we have this choice that to follow Jesus, and with the first sign of trouble, we're instantly like, "Man, I don't know about this." For me, every single time I trusted God and made a choice to do what I believed he was saying, he has always provided for me. As mentioned, I got my job at Kalani and Roosevelt literally days before having to enter the sub pool. There have been times where I have work the next day, and I've had people who I've discipled call me up at 1 in the morning, hey man, I really need to talk, and I'm just like, all right, we'll do it. And we're talking till like 4 in the morning, I get an hour of sleep, and for some reason, I am more refreshed in those times than I am when I get a full night's sleep. God has always sustained me, whether it's energy-wise, whether it's with jobs, or even there were times where when I was going through college, I got scholarships in the thousands of dollars that I did not apply for. When I graduated college, I had $10 in my bank account and 0 student loans. My last paycheck came in, and for some reason, it doubled. They accidentally paid me ahead of time, and because of that, I was able to make my last payment. God has always come through when I followed him. That doesn't mean that there weren't certain times where I was a little bit tense, wondering what was going to happen. And there were some times where I truly thought that God had let me down. But my choice was, do we get the boat anyway? Even though it's safer on land, even though there are so many good things happening, do we go out and get that boat? In Luke 9, verse 23, it says this, whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves, take up their cross daily, and follow me. Psalm 127 says this, unless the Lord builds the house, the builders labor in vain. Unless the Lord watches over the city, the guard stands in vain. And the most important to me is Matthew 6. No one can serve 2 masters, for he will either hate one and love the other, or he will be devoted to one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and Mammon. We have to choose what we're putting our trust in. Do we put our trust in what we feel God is telling us, or do we put our trust in all of our knowledge, our wisdom, and whatever we see to be correct? This is that third takeaway. Following Jesus requires our obedience, even when it doesn't make sense to our earthly selves. Now, Matthew kind of stops the story there, but luckily John picks it up in John chapter 6, verses 53 to 69. So at this time, it's talking all about Jesus walking on water, and then it kind of says they got to the other side, a crowd formed, they found him, they're like, hey, Jesus, we found you. There you are. And then he's like, hey, how are you guys doing? And he's like, you guys only come to me for bread. You don't come for signs and wonders. You come to be fed. And they're like, no, we want more signs and wonders. Bread. So what do you have for us? And so the disciples are out of the boat, Jesus is out of the boat, and this crowd that had been so high on Jesus, talking about making him king by force, has now followed them around and met up with them, and they're asking for more. So Jesus is like, okay, you want bread? Here's what I got. In John chapter 6, verse 53 to 69, it says this, Jesus said to them, very truly I tell you, unless you eat the flesh of the Son of Man and drink his blood, and have no life, you have no life in you. Whoever eats my flesh, drinks my blood, has eternal life. I will raise them up at the last day. For my flesh is real food, and my blood is real drink. Whoever eats my flesh, drinks my blood, remains in me, and I in them. Just as the living Father sent me, and I live because of the Father, so the one who feeds on me will live because of me. This is the bread that came down from heaven. Your ancestors ate manna and died, and whoever feeds on this bread will live forever. He said this while teaching in the synagogue at Capernaum. They asked for bread. He said, okay, have at it. On hearing this, many of his disciples said, this is a hard teaching. Who can accept it? Aware that his disciples were grumbling about this, Jesus said this, does this offend you? Then what if you see the Son of Man ascend to where he was before? The Spirit gives life. The flesh counts for nothing. The words I have spoken to you, they are full of the Spirit and life. Yet there are some of you who do not believe. For Jesus had known from the beginning which of them had believed and which would betray him. He went on to say this, this is why I told you, no one can come to me unless the Father has enabled them. From this time, many of his disciples turned back and no longer followed him. You do not want to leave too, do you? Jesus asked the 12. Simon Peter answered to him, Lord, to whom shall we go? You have the words of eternal life. We have come to believe and to know that you are the Holy One of God. One of the biggest challenges that I see, I have the pleasure of working with a lot of college agers and even some of my high school kids who are Christians, they'll come and talk with me. And a lot of my friends who I had grown up with in the church, one of the biggest challenges they have is they're like, yeah, but there's certain parts of the Bible just man, it just doesn't make sense. Like, it was written 2,000 years ago. There's certain, like what if we look at the Greek and the Hebrew? Does it make more sense there? Like, what if I find a translation that makes sense to how I see the world now, how the world really is? Jesus literally asked a bunch of Jewish people to eat his flesh and blood in a culture where even touching dead bodies was considered unclean. And you couldn't present yourself before the Lord after touching it, even if it was like a parent or something. Dead bodies were unclean. And he's saying, eat my flesh, drink my blood. That doesn't make any sense. And the thing I love about this is Peter, the disciples, got the boat, rode through the storm, had that moment of Peter saying, truly you are the Son of God. And then when it came to this point where they had this conflict of what Jesus is saying and what makes sense to us. And once there was that conflict, he didn't say, okay, no. So you're talking transfiguration where it's not really your blood. You're going to like take this bread and like that's your body, right? Like that's what's going to happen. He didn't say any of that. He just said, I don't know. I'm not going to go anywhere. You alone have the words to eternal life. And you are the Son of God. And that's all I know. And when we follow God, that's the decision we have to make. Sometimes, we talked about this earlier, that God offends the mind to reveal our heart. That there are certain times where I get this so often. I love the Bible. I read through the Bible. I'm just like, I don't know everything. God knows everything. But there are sometimes I catch myself being like, how can? Like, what is? I don't know. And I wish that every time I did that, God just peeled back my brain, touched my forehead, and was like, John, this is how we're like, I got it now. Because I like to know how things work. But a lot of times it doesn't happen that way. But the only thing I know for sure, Jesus is the Son of God. He's the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through him. So where else am I supposed to go? Who else am I supposed to follow? What else am I going to do? That's all we got. In the end, we all have a choice whether we're going to follow God or not. I've seen God come through time and time again for me. And this principle of learning to follow, go get the boat, has really shown itself that in those times where God has asked me to do something, God has asked me for a step of faith, whether it's something big like where I'm going to work or something as small as, hey, go buy that book, that I've noticed that God has always came through on every single time. And when we follow God, that's when we get the chance to see God for who he truly is. Jesus did not reveal his divinity to Peter and say, look, I'm the Son of God, now go in the boat. He said, guys, I know you want to be here, but go get that boat. And it put them in a situation where they got to see who he truly was. So when that test came of, hey, this doesn't make sense, I don't understand this, that they were like, I don't understand it either, but you're the Son of God, I understand that. Okay. So we're going to have some small group time now. And when we're looking at this, one of the things I really want to challenge all of you guys to is this question of, what is God calling you in your life? What are those areas where God is nudging? What is your foundation? Do you know who God is, who Jesus is? And most importantly, the thing I hope you get to take away from this is when those times come where it's like, the church says this, but the world says this. Financially, this doesn't make sense, but I just feel like we're supposed to do this. That I have seen God come through time and time again, even in times where I've had people ask me questions like, hey, John, how do you feel about abortion? How do you feel about homosexuality? And I'm there like, I'm not 100% sure how I'm going to answer this. And it's like, God, give me wisdom. And God has given me words that sometimes after I say it, I write it down like, oh, that was pretty good, But it's all about taking that step. Even when things are comfortable, do we go and get the boat? Are we willing to go and say, hey, I feel like God's saying this just somewhere in my knower, somewhere just something's nudging. I'm just going to take that step. So in your small groups today, the first thing that we're going to do is we have like some little questions for you. And I think the biggest thing is it's hard to say, okay, this is what God's been saying. Maybe there is something that God's been laying on your heart when I'm talking about this, when I was mentioning my 4 different stories that you're like, you know what? I had that exact same experience. I had this conversation. It's just gnawing at me. Maybe you have that. Great. But if not, don't worry, don't sweat it. Don't feel like you're pressured to like force yourself to come up with anything. But when we're doing this, it's really just to prime you and say, hey, are there things that God has done in your life that you've seen, yeah, this principle of go get the boat has been true? Or is there something that's been gnawing on you that you feel that God is calling you to do? If not, that's fine. But what I challenge you to do is just pray that God gives you those eyes to see, those ears to hear, because trust me, it says the harvest is plentiful, but the workers are few. God is just looking for people to be able to say, hey, use me.